Hello. Welcome to the Kensington Corner. I am Jeff.
And I am Tom. Today we are very lucky to have Stephanie Davis, who is the Suicidal Prevention Coordinator of Eastern VA of Kansas.
Eastern Kansas.
Eastern Kansas, VA. There we go.
There you go.
She has a PhD in counseling psychology.
Correct.
Awesome. How are you doing today?
I'm doing okay. Thank you so much for having me on your show. I appreciate it.
We have been super excited to do this episode with you. We're going to end up kind of repeating everything we literally just talked about for the last 10 minutes.
Which is good.
I guess I am curious, though. He did mention your PhD. What is your educational background?
So I did my undergrad at University of Iowa, and I had an undergraduate degree in psychology. And I remember that my sister wrote in my graduation card, practice this, Stephanie. Would you care for fries with that? Because an undergrad in psychology doesn't get you a whole lot.
I'm an undergrad in psych as well.
So then I knew I wanted to go to graduate school, and I was really desperately clueless in terms of how to narrow down schools. And my roommate at the time was a huge basketball fan. And so I ended up at KU, of course, for the amazing education as well. But
exactly.
So I went straight into the PhD program there.
Very cool.
And spent about 6 years there. So
amazing. So, I like I said earlier, I have a history degree, so I'm not really doing much other than mopping up soda on my computer with that thing.
Right.
So,
yeah.
But I'm always curious to know, like, what was the process like for you? I'm curious personally because Tom and I, as we said earlier, we're both pre-meds, and we're kind of in that situation where we've got a long road of education ahead of us. Do you got any tips or pointers or pitfalls to avoid, anything like that, or just live it and love it and do it? Or
that's it. I think that I just got so accustomed to being a student for so long, it didn't occur to me not to be.
Right.
And so that was just my daily lived experience, was kind of slogging day in and day out. I do remember sort of freaking out about writing that dissertation, but then realizing that it's just a big paper.
Yeah.
It's no different than anything else. I had a coworker that used to say, how do you eat an elephant? One bite at a time. And
that's the truth, isn't it?
Yeah, you wake up and you're at the other end of it. But I still do have those moments where I stop and recognize how grateful I feel that I don't have a paper pending over my head or an upcoming test.
Right.
It's nice.
We can definitely relate to that. We got absolutely hammered in class last week, so it was ugly. But we're here today, so that's what counts.
But on the flip side, we always talk about too how like both of us have lived life for the last decade, so we're having like the time of our life right now. I would take being a student any day over the real world. I love it.
And I think that coming at it from a non-traditional route probably gives you an entirely different perspective. I think that was the thing that I struggled with, was everything that I learned was about theory. And I really wanted to get to the application part, but what do I do with this? How do I actually help people? Because this is why I'm in this field. And so I could memorize a whole bunch of facts. But then once I got thrown into the actual field, it was terrifying for me, because I was like, oh my gosh, what if I do the wrong thing? What if I say the wrong thing?
Yeah, absolutely. It's kind of like the education really starts once your education ends type of deal, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
So how did you end up with with Veterans Affairs then? How did that happen?
So in graduate school for psychology, you start kind of the experiential piece. You start with a practicum, and the practicum advisor sort of assigns you to that wherever you're going to be. And so my very first practicum was at the Leavenworth VA, and my very first patient was a World War II veteran. And he looked at me and he was like, what's a little whippersnapper like you going to help me? How are you going to help me? And I literally just said, I don't know. I had practicum every week on Wednesdays at the VA, and I carpooled. And every day on the way there and on the way back, I would cry because I didn't feel like I knew what I was doing. And I also knew how important that work was. Mm-hmm. And I was terrified that they would be better off with somebody else, that I wasn't the right person to be helping them. But I knew I needed to learn, but I didn't want that to be at the expense of anybody. And in retrospect, I don't think it was. I'm sure I did just fine. But so I never imagined that I would have ended up at the VA. But, I did another practicum at the VA. Then I ended up in my internship at the VA. I did a postdoc residency at the VA. And then I was just hooked because there just really isn't anything like working in this environment. There is so much need, and the people that I work with are so incredibly grateful. And this feels just, it's important work that you're doing.
Right. And what year was that?
My internship?
Yeah.
Oh boy, that was probably 2001.
So and the only reason I asked that is because the mental health awareness as we know it now was not present then, correct?
A lot of things have changed in mental health since then. Yes.
Yeah.
And I mean, I think especially the way that we do psychotherapy, a lot of what I was originally taught was a lot of underlying theory, but then ultimately kind of the end product was a lot of supportive work, which is lovely. And there is absolutely a place for supportive psychotherapy. I completely believe that. But as the science sort of caught up to the practice, we recognize, a lot of what we do is what we call empirically based psychotherapies. And these are protocols that have been they researched the dickens out of them, and they know that they work, and they know exactly why they work.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, Jeff and I are both huge advocates for mental health. I think with our own kind of personal battles with a lot of things. So I think for one, we're kind of drawn to it a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So, I personally am very passionate about this, and obviously not in a professional context like you are, but I'm just, I think my main thing is because whether I'm in school, whatever, it's just I want to be open about my experiences with it, because I at least in my mind, I still think there's a lot of things about mental health that are taboo. Obviously, I'm not a professional like you, but I think just having people that are open to sharing their experiences and telling people what an amazing experience it was for them, because honestly, going to therapy and going through the whole process, it's something that literally changed my life. And I don't know if I mentioned this earlier, but I think my backup plan, I'd love to go to med school, but is to get into some sort of counseling position if that doesn't work, because I've seen what it's done for myself, and I think it's such important work.
Well, absolutely. And I appreciate that perspective in terms of you guys sharing your own lived experience. I mean, that's what this takes. It's, for whatever reason, mental health concerns have had this stigma associated with it. And there really isn't any reason for that. And, I oftentimes say, if you saw your buddy limping all of a sudden, you wouldn't hesitate to say, hey, man, what happened to your leg?
Right.
But we see people withdrawing. We see people shutting down. We see people isolating and dropping out of society, and for whatever reason, people aren't like, hey buddy, what's going on? And that's exactly what we need to do, is just recognize that mental health conditions, physical health conditions, it's all the same. We just have to be able to talk about it.
Well, for a while, and just from the military perspective, from a lot of things, is that until about 15, 16, it was, I remember I think the first time I ever thought about going to see someone was 2012. And might have been 2013 actually. I just got promoted to staff sergeant. And one of my peers was like, dude, I would not do that. He was like, you'll never see 7. And I was like, all right, man. Yeah. And it was a big thing for a long time, because they're not supposed to be like, hey, this guy went to see mental health. But once it's a known thing, you were kind of shunned for it for a long time. And looking back on it now, when I was younger, I probably was that guy too. Because I got promoted quickly. So at 22, 23, I was a staff sergeant. I probably was kind of like, man, that guy's kind of weak, and then you kind of grow up and you go through some things, and then you realize you got some issues yourself. And I think the stigma is really what stops a lot of people from reaching out to help, because it's already hard enough.
No problem.
Hey, we'll stop real quick and then we'll...
Oh, no, that's okay. I can... I apologize. Okay.
No, you're good.
Fortunately, we've got a very talented sound editor.
Okay.
He edits everything out for us. Thank you,
Okay.
Corey.
Yeah.
But you know, you go through these things through life, and I think it's hard to watch somebody obviously go through these struggles, but at the same time, we haven't, from childhood, we haven't conditioned people yet to be like, is everything okay in that manner? Because for so long it's been, if a person's feeling suicidal or if a person's feeling withdrawn like that, then they obviously have an issue that you can't help them with. No matter what happens in life, they're always going to feel that way. Whether it be they're weak, crazy, miserable. I mean, you know, you can go back to just 60, 70 years ago and look at the practices we had in psychology at the time. It's medieval. Like,
completely.
You know what I'm saying?
Yes.
So it's
Yeah, you admit that you're feeling bad and they're going to start boring holes in your head.
yeah. Well, you know, it's funny because one of our favorite shows, it's called, have you ever seen Mad Men at all?
Do you know what? I haven't. I know it's an entire phenomenon in our society.
It's great. But one of the things they hit on there a lot is that, you know, there's a ton of drinking in the advertising world, but in the first like 2 episodes, going to therapy is a big thing. And it's kind of like, it becomes like the rumor mill. Like, oh, I heard his wife saw a therapist. And it's funny now because like, it's like,
it shows you that juxtaposition.
Well, yeah, because now, like, I mean, our age, you're like, I got a therapy point. Like, it's like a badge of honor.
Yeah.
Well, because it's just real, you know?
Well, the example you gave, like the comparing it to, you know, like seeing your buddy limping, I really think that's a great way to look at it. And we don't really talk about it in those types of terms, but I mean, it is a very real and it in most cases very fixable phenomenon. And
absolutely.
But yeah, it's one of those things, and I see it getting better all the time, and we still have work to do. And what is it with maybe this is getting too personal, but do you see a lot of open acceptance of kind of like mental health and within the VA association? Like, well, what's it like around here? What are the attitudes in your opinion?
Well, I feel like I get a skewed perception because I am in mental health, and I think sometimes I forget that everybody isn't the same way. So I forget that there may still be some stigma out there in the world because that's just us. This is what we do on a daily basis. And even, you know, I had a coworker the other day that said, Stephanie, sometimes I just come in here to ask you about a specific item on our agenda, and I end up walking out and saying, why did I end up talking about my childhood and my parents just then?
Right.
She's like, you just do this. And I was like, I genuinely can't help it. I'm curious about people, and I just ask follow-up questions, and I want to know what makes them tick. And that to me is fascinating. And I don't know why that's something that shouldn't be acceptable to talk about.
Well, yeah, I mean, we did our first ever episode was on dealing with depression, anxiety, and stress. And I don't know if it was in that order of what we said, but one of the things that blew my mind is that we started getting a lot of feedback from people, especially people I deployed with. And I mean, I knew people struggled. I mean, my first deployment, I was telling Jeff this the other day, my first deployment, I think brigade-wide, there's been like over 20 suicides from 08, 13 within 177. I think that's it's somewhere around there. It's something crazy. Yeah. But I would just get feedback from people that were like, "Why didn't know you had issues like that? Like, you've always been like this, like, strong leader kind of person." And I was like, yeah, but I think it takes people like us being able to talk about it for it to become a national conversation, because it's still in, I think, the generation ahead of us, I think it's still viewed as like only the people with real issues who are going to, like, you know, shoot up a hospital or something are the ones that have mental issues. And that's just not true. And when you try to tell people, like, no, that's not true. Or if you saw me like at a dinner or something and I told you like I had issues, that people are like, well, no, you're pretty well put together. I don't think that's true. No, it is, man. It's 100% true. So I think for me, that's the biggest hurdle is I think there's a conversation that's there. I just don't believe people are really willing to to talk about it just yet. And then it really seems the only time they are willing to talk about it is when it happens to someone close to them. When it's their son or daughter, then it's time to talk about it. And for me, I think that's the wrong way to look at it.
And I absolutely think that that's why there is such power in conversations like these, because people can see somebody and say, oh, that's me. I recognize myself in that person. And recognizing that depression, anxiety, PTSD, suicidal ideation, it cuts across all socioeconomic status, race, gender, ethnicity, religion, geography. It cuts across all of that.
Right.
And it is powerful when people speak out. I don't know if you remember when Jason Kander, who was the former Secretary of State for Missouri, was in the mayor's race for Kansas City, and he last fall publicly stepped away and said, you know what, I'm struggling with PTSD, and last night I called the Veterans Crisis Line because I've been struggling with thoughts about suicide.
Right.
And I remembered reading that on social media, and I just got chills, and I was like, this man has just done more to reduce the stigma of talking about mental health than I can ever do in my career, because this is my job, but he's this person. And I, quickly reposted that. And the very next day, part of my job is I respond to calls that have been placed to the Veterans Crisis Line.
Okay.
And then they'll send a consult out. And so then I get that consult. And I got a call from a Veterans Crisis Line responder, and she said, I just spoke with somebody who called the crisis line, and he mentioned that when he saw this article about Jason Kander, it kind of broke something in him, because he too is pretty prominent, and he recognized himself in that, and he couldn't deny to himself any longer that he's been struggling with PTSD. He's been struggling with suicidal ideation. And so I was able to just that moment reach back out to this person and just start connecting him on his healing journey. Yeah. And so it just was this really poignant reminder of the power of those conversations.
Well, and I mean, at its core, really, what that is that's leadership by example. I mean, that you don't tell people what to do, you show them how to do it. And I mean, that does take a large amount of personal courage to do what he did, because I mean, it's easy for me to, be talking to one of my, 20-year-old classmates and say, hey, yeah, I've struggled with depression, I've done this. But I mean, when you're in the public eye like that, you're absolutely right. That's absolutely amazing. I actually want to just kind of jump back and piggyback on what you were saying, though, about conversation, the whole idea. And, while you were making that point, it hit me that when I was going through therapy for the first time, I think that was actually the conversation aspect of it was one of the most useful tools for me personally, because I learned basically how to talk about what I was feeling by the examples of other people. I didn't know how to verbalize what I was going through, but I sat next to someone who did, and, gave me ways to learn it, and gave, and showed me by example how to do this. And, it's funny, because if I'm talking about my feelings, I probably, instead of, using 2 different adjectives now, I probably use, 12, and I probably need to expand that to a couple hundred, but it's still, it's a skill, isn't it? I mean, so many things with mental health are just skills.
It absolutely is a skill. And it's also, the minute we put words to an experience, we begin to shape it. And so sometimes the very words that we use shape our own perception of what happened. That's part of why trauma that happens, but when somebody is pre-verbal, when it happens in childhood, they never can really get it out and process it and really understand what happened, because they were never able to put words to it. And when we use those words, so in our brains, the right half is dominated more by emotion and imagery, and the left half is dominated by logic and language. And so in order to get an experience to cross the corpus callosum, you have to put words to it in order to then be able to sort of logically analyze it. Mm-hmm. Otherwise, it just gets stuck over here in this amorphous imagery and emotion, and you can never really define it.
Essentially, you have to have your brain working together to work through that experience.
To work through it. Yeah. And so we start putting words to it, and we start pulling it over to the other side of the brain. And then absolutely you can, so not only does that help then to sort of make more sense of it and where that experience falls on your journey, but then there's also a skill to being able to share your story with others in a way that can be healing and helpful to them.
Yeah.
And there's a whole aspect in suicide prevention that's called safe messaging, and it's everywhere from social media to the traditional news media, to people who share their stories in a public light, and make sure that we're doing that in a way that is safe and that provides hope to the audience, to the listening audience. Because at the end of the day, most suicidal ideation is driven by treatable underlying conditions or solvable or transient problems. And so I think it's really important to get out there exactly what you're talking about, that message of like, hey, this stuff works.
Yeah, it really does. Like, and it's so funny because I can say from my personal experience, like I was so adverse to going through the process. And basically what happened with me is my mom basically set me down and said, I can't watch you do what you're doing to yourself anymore. We need to figure something out. And I ended up going through the process, and that first I actually went to an outpatient clinic where I was, basically going in for therapy every day. And I remember that first week I was like, this is bullshit. I don't want to be here. And then after I got to about the end of my second week, it was like the light flipped on. I was like, holy shit, this actually works. And it's a really empowering feeling too. And, I think that's at least in my mind, I think that's the message, is that you can learn, you can learn skills, and there are people that will help you. And it's very empowering to know that you don't have to live the way you're living. And
because my main hiccup with me ever going and actually getting help, it wasn't, a lot of people I feel like they think like, oh, they're embarrassed, and for me it was never that, as much as I humbly thought that I was more intelligent than the person I would be talking to. So why in the world would I sit but I do bring this back into one bad therapy session I had that really shaped. I went in and I talked to someone, I think after my third deployment, and she handed me a sheet with like pictures on it and was like, take this with you throughout the day. And anytime you get like anxious or angry, like write down like next to the picture, like which one. And I was like, yeah, no, like that will not be a thing. So I walked out and I was like, then like I checked out of the appointment. She's like, you want to set up another appointment? I was like, no, thank you. And I left. And I remember walking out of that and being like, was she a child psychologist? Did she not know what she was talking about? Am I losing my mind? And I was like, I'll never go back. I'll never go back.
And I mean, you and I kind of had that conversation when we first started, going, and Tom was going through some stuff, and I was really encouraging him, to try something else, essentially. And I think that I obviously I am not a professional, but what are your thoughts on that? That if you're say going and seeing a therapist that doesn't work for you, I mean, you be your own advocate, right? Like try something different,
100%.
Yeah.
And so much. As much as we see psychology as a science, and I think it wants to be a hard science, there is an art to it as well.
Well, yeah.
And I think that there is a piece of that connection between the therapist and the client, who that's a really important piece of the puzzle. In fact, there's like some study out there that talks about like the what are the actual change agents in psychotherapy, and 40% of change is from extra therapeutic things. Like it has nothing to do with the therapy session,
right.
And like a small sliver of it has to do with the actual techniques, but most of it is the relationship. And so you got to have that good fit. And so if it's not a good fit, absolutely go find somebody else. But I think that and I'm so glad that you had the courage to try somebody else, Tom, because I think that that's the danger that happens sometimes when somebody does have a bad experience with therapy or a bad experience with the VA. And if they are very vocal, it's like, that place sucks.
Yeah.
Think of how many people's lives you may have just inadvertently negatively impacted by saying, don't go get therapy there because it doesn't work.
Right. Mm-hmm.
And I think it's really important, and so I'm so grateful that y'all are saying like, oh no, this shit works, you know, like come on back over.
That's also though part of like the cancel culture we're going through right now is that when we talk about things that are shared social media wise, you never really see the thousands of lives the VA saves in a year. You see the one or two people that had a bad experience.
Yeah.
And that's a really hard thing to go through right now. And then, you know, you get, I know that Topeka for a really, really long time, I don't know the statistic now, but they were as high as what, third in the nation in PTSD care for a while?
Oh, in terms of like our nationally renowned PTSD unit? Yeah, absolutely.
And so
they do amazing things.
Yeah, and so there was a lot of people that would be like, oh, you know, Topeka's great, but then would shit on Kansas City. And it's like, well, I'm sure there's great professionals in Kansas City too. It just needs work. Like you need to, you know, and so that's the hard part for me is that, you know, Jeff and I have talked about this, is that it's hard when we're in a society now where singular events really shape, and you don't get all the full story a lot of the times, but I don't think that we talk a lot about the success stories anymore. And I think that's what we kind of try to do. I can't name names of physicians that work here, can I?
Probably not.
Okay, good. Okay,
yeah.
Probably should do that. Probably should not do that. Yeah. But there is a nurse practitioner here, and if she's listening, and hopefully I've told her about it. Whatever, she's dope. Like she's super.
If it's a shout out, I think that's totally fine.
Yeah. What's I always mess up her name. She's got two last names. No, I don't know. Roxy Joanna.
Roxy Johanning.
Roxy Johanning.
Yes.
See, I think she's pretty dope too.
Just so you know, there's two things in life I can't do.
Spell and talk.
Yes. Science words, which is horrible, and last names. I can't. I mess them all up. In fact, anytime I call for my prescription, I'm like, is Joanna Roxy there? I do it every time. And they're like, yeah, Roxy's here. I'm like, all right, cool. And then I look down at my bottle and I'm like, oh, that's not her name. It's the other way around.
It happens.
But anyway, she is amazing. And I kind of got pushed off onto someone that was an intern here who was awesome as well. But she was only good. She had told me, we sat down. She said, I'm only going to be able to be here for you for about 4 to 6 sessions, depending on how you want to do this. Mm-hmm. I said, yeah, cool. Let's see. Let's start. It was cool. And I talked to Jeff and I was like, man, you know, I've never been on meds before. I've never even tried this route before. It's never been a thing for me. He's like, I think you should try it. You know, if you think it's going to help you, try.
Yep.
I said, cool. So I went in. That was the biggest, that by far was the biggest challenge for me. It wasn't the therapy. Asking to talk to somebody was easy, but going in and having that stigma of like, especially in today's big pharma world, of being like, I need some pills. You know, that's how I felt, you know? Yes. And I was like, hey, what do you think about this? And she's like, well, you know, we have these like PTSD tests you can take. We have the anxiety test, and there's one more. There's one more test you can take and see where you scale at. And so I scaled on like all 3. Depression was the other one. I scaled on like all 3, whatever. And she's like, yeah, we'll take you back. We'll talk to somebody. And I met Roxy. Mm-hmm. And I sit down and she like looks at me dead in the face. She's like, so no bullshit. Like I was like, oh,
we're getting real.
I was like, we're on. I was like, we're good. I was like, we're good here. And we just talked about some stuff. And but I told Jeff that she was just so real with me. She was just like, yeah, blah blah. And she's like, and by the way, just so like you can't say I didn't tell you, you may take these pills and you may have erectile dysfunction. So just so you need to know. And I said, oh, okay, you know, but I wasn't ready for that. As far as it was a sigh of relief, but I wasn't. For me, I like walked out of there and I was like, oh my God, my whole life just changed.
Yes.
You know what I'm saying? Like yes. I had that like that moment where I was like, that was really actually cool. And it was the first time. And like when I got out of the military, for example, this is how much I never went to see a doctor. When I got out of the military, I sat down with the VA representative. And he said, hey man, list everything you have. As far as what you could claim.
Where you broken down,
yeah,
basically.
And I was like, I've only been to sick call for my knee. When I tore the PCL on my knee and had surgery. And he was like, yeah, I got that, but what else? And I was like, no, I don't have anything else. I got my wisdom teeth out. Like, I don't have anything else on file. Like, I've never been. And he was like, was anything bothering you? And I was like, my elbow kind of hurt. He's like, yeah, write it down. We'll see.
This conversation.
Yeah. And so I was like, I don't have anything else, you know. But he, after I, you know, signed everything, sent away, he was like, I'm not lying, dude. Most people have anywhere between 15 to 30 things they write down to see. And that kind of blew my mind. So I think that was the toughest part for me, was like, I've never needed help before. So asking for help is already tough enough. And then it was just cool. I thought they did a really good job overall as a team of making someone like me feel comfortable. Someone who wrestled with the fact of like, do I actually need help? I probably do, but can I just tough it out without killing myself? We'll see. But my life would be miserable. So that was the tough part for me.
Yeah. Yeah. And it sounds like when you're sitting down across from Roxy and she can just be a human being.
Yeah.
I think that the field of mental health has gone that direction, but I also think that as somebody is in the field for a while, like, you start to learn how to just be your own self in the therapeutic session. And so that, I mean, it isn't doctor and patient, you know, it's like, man, we're all human beings and we're all doing the damn best that we can with what we've been given. And sometimes life gets overwhelming and we need each other. And that's not an issue. That is a part of the human condition. We all need each other from time to time. Yeah. We are herd creatures by nature, and we have to have human connection for survival.
Well, and you mentioned it earlier. I think that's why I think for so many people, isolating is such a huge red flag, right? I mean, I know that's one of mine. Like, when I start, it's like literally like that is like number one on my list. Like, when I start saying no to social stuff or stuff with my family, like, I know that's like, okay, there's something else going on here,
I do safety plans with anybody who comes into the hospital with thoughts about suicide. That sometimes, during times of stress, they get thoughts about suicide. That's the number one thing that I hear. And I oftentimes give the analogy of, our brains are built to propagate our species, survival of the fittest. In a wolf pack, if a wolf knows that it is sick and dying, what does it do?
Leaves the pack.
It leaves the pack.
To die.
It goes off alone to die. And because it doesn't want to infect the rest of the pack, it doesn't want to bring the pack down in terms of being able to get food. It sees itself as a burden on that pack, and so it goes off. Depression, a depressed brain is a physiologically inflamed brain. Right. So our brain knows that it is sick. And so those signals of, the brain is telling somebody, isolate. But what we know is that depression isn't contagious. And actually, that's the last thing that you want to do when you're starting to feel depressed. You need to connect more, because that sends those safe signals to the brain, and it gives you the availability of connection and care and optimal, getting help. And
absolutely.
I wasn't trying to laugh earlier, but when I got back from Italy, Jeff was watching Mad Men again. And so I was like, well, I got to start watching Mad Men again. We're going to binge watch it. So I started binge watching. But about 3 weeks ago, I texted him. And there's a scene in Mad Men towards the very end where the main character basically stops at a bus stop and gives his car away to a stranger. So I text Jeff. I'm laying in my bed watching Mad Men. And I thought he would get the reference. And I said, hey, man, I need a ride. I just gave my car away to a stranger. And then I quoted the Mad Men part. And he was like, what? And so he thought I gave my car.
Well, so there's a little more to this story, was that Tom had kind of been having a rough week. And like, I legit thought that like he had just given his car to a homeless person in Lawrence. And like, it was a whole like,
you're like showing up at his doorstep with the posse gonna save him.
It was a whole like failure to communicate situation. But like, I literally was like, oh my God.
He just texted back.
No, and I did. I was like on like I literally got my keys and was getting ready to drive over to his house. I was legitimately worried about him. And then, he texted me back. He's like, it's from the show. I was like, you scared me to death, man. Like,
but you know what? You were willing to get in your car and drive over to his house. And that's what we've got to do.
Absolutely.
We've got to be not afraid to do that. And maybe you feel like a jerk when you realize that you didn't get the Mad Men quote and that you're just kidding. But my God, what if they weren't?
Yeah.
Well, and that's the thing too. That's what, like, I for me, it's huge. I harp on it a lot because I still have a lot of connections to a ton of veterans, like across the board, a ton of veterans. And I really do believe that it is imperative that people with our backgrounds, and not only our backgrounds, who we are now. I mean, a lot of veterans see us in newspaper articles. I mean, we get hit up. We're on the Student Alumni Board at Kansas. You know, we started this. And we're kind of seen a lot in the public eye that way. And I think when people see like, oh my God, these guys are doing successful things while also being challenged with, you know, whatever, you know, problems they're having in life, and they're able to talk about it, that's huge. Like that's a big thing. And I believe it gives people avenues of approach now to not have to worry so much about, am I going to be frowned upon or looked at differently if I speak out about what's bothering me?
Well,
right.
And in honesty, like, I mean, that's part of the, I feel like this podcast in general is hugely therapeutic for us. Just that we have that chance to connect with other people and have these conversations. And I mean, Tom will tell you, there's been multiple times where like, I've been having a crappy day and we'll have something like lined up, or we'll have a podcast lined up, and I will show up and I'll just be like, you can tell I do not want to be there. And it's like, it's funny how it can like literally just sitting down and like taking time away from, you know, the things that are bothering you. Like it can be very therapeutic. Like we've done at least 2 where I've showed up
2 or 3,
just literally like pissy as all get out. And I've walked out of that place smiling. So it's, you know, it's a positive for us too, whether, you know, we're actually doing mental health topics or we're just talking with, you know, folks in the local community at Lawrence.
We did one, and I've mentioned it every podcast since, so I'm going to keep my streak going.
Okay.
We did one that, like, Jeff literally was like, dude, I'm going to go, and I'm leaving, and I don't want to be there. And I was like, all right, man. And he shows up, and we both are kind of like, we didn't know what to expect. We weren't even sure if we wanted to do it. And then it was like, it was one of the wildest things I've ever heard in my life. And 2, it was a great podcast. And we both left, and we're like, that was fun.
So glad I didn't miss that one.
Yeah. Because like, we haven't had any really where we've I had one where I was sick and rescheduled, but we haven't we've never rescheduled anyone. But there's times when you show up to do things, just like with anything in life. There's times when you show up to do things and you're like, I don't even know how this is gonna go. Like,
I feel like I've got more important stuff on my plate right now. Yeah. And no, it's been a really positive experience all the way around for us, I think.
Well, yeah, and I think too is that with anything you do in life is that if it's starting to bring, and I use success loosely, not financially successful, but when you start to see a pros versus cons list, and you're getting mostly pros from something, you start to value it a little bit more. And that was the hard time for us because we're both so busy. So you're trying to schedule these podcasts with people, and you're trying to mitigate the stress between you two, but then also the third party, you know? And so when we started doing that, we actually started getting, like, we'll get just responses from people that are like, hey, like, I just listened to this episode. Thank you guys so much. And I was like, what in the world, dude, is happening?
It's funny. I see this like as the podcast for me has always been kind of like a creative outlet, which I mean is that's one of those things, like, I think was personally for me, like going through my mental health journey, like getting back to doing the things I loved was like one of the I remember, I've told Tom this story before. I don't know if I've ever told it on air, but I remember one of the things that my therapist told me to do is, you know, start re-engaging with your old hobbies. And I used to, when I was growing up, I loved to read a lot. And I'd kind of gotten away from that, hadn't really done it. And I picked up a book my brother had gotten me probably like 2 years before for Christmas. And I remember I was sitting there reading through that book, and like it was the first time in the longest time that I actually had felt something that was like positive and good. Like I remember getting goosebumps on my arm, and I was like, I think that was kind of like my light bulb moment for therapy, that I was like, oh my God, this is amazing. And so I think that engaging in those things you love and finding creative outlets, I think that that's so important.
Well, and I'm also hearing from the two of you that this thing is so important to you because you know you're reaching other people. You're helping. And that's sort of the secret sauce, I think, with most people, but I think veterans especially, is that y'all are way more likely to do something to help somebody else than you are for yourselves. And so when we can find that outlet, when we can find something that connects both of those, where you're helping other people, oh, by and large, you also start to get there yourself, you know?
Well, yeah, I agree, because one of the things I struggle with a lot is losing people. Let's see, I'm trying to say this without sounding insensitive. To me, suicide is one of the most, I don't want to say useless, most preventable deaths, obviously, obviously, because there's a choice involved, no matter which outlet you want to go with it. But the surprise of it is something that I have found never goes away. Doesn't matter if it's somebody that I thought could, was going down a bad path, or just someone that you would never suspect it from, which happens a lot. I just think that we as veterans need to do more than post on Facebook, hey, I'm going to do 22 push-ups a day. Great movement. I'm cool with it. That's fine. It's not helping anybody. Because
awareness without action doesn't lead to any lasting results.
Yeah. And for me, and I don't care what people think. To me, it just seems like a very selfish, like, hey, I need a social media kind of, I need these likes, so I'm gonna post this video of me doing these push-ups. That's how I've always felt about it. I've never done one, so that's how I felt about it. But that's not to say there aren't good people out there, the organizations that are doing it, but I just think there needs to be more awareness brought to it, and I don't think people know how. I think that's why they do.
Absolutely, I was just going to say that. I would hope that most people, might find pictures of kittens playing the piano if all they want are likes. I think that somebody that's posting about veteran suicide genuinely wants to be a part of this helpful movement, and we are all aware. I think that that's something that. At first it was that 22 number. Now it's 20 veterans who die each day. Yeah, by suicide.
And I'm curious about this. Was the 22? It was kind of not obviously not a made up statistic, but it was based on something that was it actually 22 a day, or was it 20? It was something weird when it first came out.
When they started to dig into that data, it was. When they're pulling together this data, it's the VA, DOD, CDC who are pulling all of these numbers, and it's really hard to narrow down exactly, make sure you're not double counting something, making sure. And so they have refined their processes in terms of how they're doing that. That was the number. And there was some question as to whether or not they were actually counting active duty deaths by suicide. And so what the number is now is 123 Americans die each day in our country by suicide. Of those, 20 are veterans and 1 to 2 are active duty service members. Okay. And the data seem to be pretty consistent for the last several years. It's important to note that of those 20, 14 of those veterans aren't connected with the VA for care. Uh-huh. And so, and of the 6 who are connected, only 3 are involved in mental health care. And so anytime I'm talking to a group of veterans or a group of community members, I'm saying, like we talked about before, we do know that we can address those underlying conditions and problems, and that somebody isn't going to be stuck in that place of pain for forever. We can treat, we can heal, we can move forward, and life's not going to be there. But if we don't know who they are, we can't help them. Yeah, right. And so that's why it's so important for traditional and non-traditional veteran service organizations, and for community members, and for business owners, and for providers in the community to recognize this, because I may not know who those 14 are, but you all do. They're in your Facebook feed and they're in your contacts list. And so we all have to be in this together. Mm-hmm. And the VA recognizes, do you know what? We may not be for everybody. That's okay. We don't have to be it for everybody. But we've all got to be holding hands across this country and providing this web of support, and not being in these silos, not being territorial about help, but just being there for each other and reaching out to anybody that you see that looks like they're struggling.
Absolutely.
Go
ahead.
The thing I loved most about the VA, though, was just how simple it was. And I think that's something, honestly, that's not talked about enough when you talk about even if it's active duty members getting out once they're out. It's not that the VA isn't present when you're getting out, because it is. You go through everything when you're getting out, and you know about the VA. But I think a lot of times that when we're looking at when people are getting out of the military, they're so already. I was bitter. I was so ready to be done. Mm-hmm. It took me about a year, actually, to when I was like, okay, now I'm okay again to talk about things. I was just like, I was done. And I think a lot of people get out and their first reaction is, I'm going to distance myself as far as I can from anything that has to do military related. I'm going to grow my beard. I'm going to grow my hair out, and I don't want to see another veteran. And it wasn't that bad for me, obviously. I mean, I went to the VA, so I just, the simplicity of it is what made it easy. I just thought it was, when you think about saying, hey, I need help to somebody that you don't know, I guess in my head, I never envisioned their reaction. I never thought about that. Mm-hmm. But when you say it to somebody and they're like, all right, man, cool.
Let's get
you some help. You're like, that's it.
That's all I had to say.
That's it.
So I've got another question. You mentioned this, basically like action is really what we need to solve this problem. And, Tom and I being back at school, obviously we're plugged in with, all sorts of, whether they're pre-med, pre-farm in Greek life, or in, one of the pre-med fraternities or pre-health fraternities. Even we got a lot of people who, I bet every day I talk to someone, I need to find something else to do. What kind of opportunities do you have for, like, say, those folks around here at the VA? I mean, we're 20 minutes down the road, basically. I think Tom picked me up at 10 after, and we got here a little late, but that's just Tom. So
that is just me. But yeah, we got here in about 20 minutes.
Yeah. I mean, you guys are really close. You guys are providing a great resource to our community, our veterans. Do you guys have a lot of opportunities for, like, say, KU students if they'd be one to get involved over here?
So there is voluntary service, mm-hmm. and there's a very specific process that people go through in order to become an actual volunteer at the VA. And they do that. They make it that way for protection, because they want to make sure that somebody coming here is genuine and is going to have the time and have the energy and the availability to continuously be there, time after time. So that's kind of the best way in terms of the VA per se. But I think that there's just so much more that we can do in our world in general. I think that one of the most important things, like we've been talking about, is to reduce the stigma of talking about mental health. And one simple thing that people can do is, in context of suicide prevention, to abolish the word commit. Typically, we think of you commit a crime. Mm-hmm. And so what that does, suicide, what it does is it lends to that stigma of that person is doing something wrong, mm-hmm. Or bad. And what we know is that nobody ever chooses suicide. Sometimes people, I picture it that they're just dangling off the edge of a skyscraper and they're holding on for all they've got. Yep. And then one more thing just piles down on top and they can't do it anymore and they succumb. And so nobody ever chooses it. And so we can substitute words like, that person died by suicide, mm-hmm. that person ended their life. But just that one small step can really help.
But I mean, that's kind of would you say that that's kind of a problem across mental health, the way we talk about it in general? Like, just, you're saying something as simple as the verbs we use, right? Mm-hmm. Like, I have depression versus I suffer from depression, those sorts of things. Like,
absolutely. Yeah. It's calling somebody schizophrenic. Uh-huh. No, that's not the entirety of their being. Yeah. This is a human being with thoughts and dreams and hopes and fears and, and also is diagnosed with schizophrenia, you know?
We have a very, very bad habit sometimes about making those things about that person's identity when it, like you said, it's not. It's just, it's something they're struggling with, right? You know, it's one small aspect of a much greater and, you know, potentially powerful person, right? I mean,
right. I happen to be very good at animal noises, but that's not the entirety of my being, you know?
If that's all it took for me, if that's all I was known for, I'd be okay with that. There's Tom the Animal Noise guy. I'd be like,
we can maybe have a competition.
Yeah, I'd be like, we're all right.
I'm gonna record it for sure.
I can only do like a meow, maybe a soft bark. I don't know.
I can see that being a useful skill.
Where do you think it goes from here? We're here. We're talking about these conversations. But we're all three, and then even, you know, Jason, HC, like all these guys they're advocates. But where does it go from here? What is the actual next logical step?
Right. So some of the other things that people can do, obviously recognize those signs and symptoms of suicide risk. The American Association of Suicidology uses the acronym ISPathWarm, which is kind of a dumb acronym, but it's the only thing that they could. But so, you know, recognizing, is that person struggling with ideation, suicidal ideation, substance use, a sense of purposelessness, increased anger or rage, feeling trapped, feeling hopeless, withdrawing from friends and family, feeling increased anxiety or agitation, real reckless or risky behavior. Those are some of those things where sometimes when I'll be talking with somebody, I'm like, are you kind of flirting with death? And they're like, yeah, I'm not actually trying to end my life, but I'm kind of flirting with it. And that can be that risky behavior. And then out of character mood swings. So when you start to see those signs, or if somebody is posting on social media questions about death or dying, seeking access to means, just kind of asking about, what combination of medications might be lethal, or asking about purchasing a gun. Those are all those things that we can key into. Mm-hmm. And when you see it, directly reach out to that person. The VA uses the acronym SAVE, so it's look for those signs of suicide. Ask the questions, and it's important to actually ask the question.
To be direct.
Are you having thoughts about suicide? Yep. Don't beat around the bush. I early on in my career, I asked somebody one time, I said, are you having thoughts of hurting yourself? And he said, no, I'm not having thoughts of hurting myself. I'm having thoughts of killing myself.
Yeah.
And studies have shown people just want you to ask the question. And oftentimes people are afraid, well, like if I say that word, then it's going to implant it in somebody's head. And we know that asking thoughts about suicide isn't going to cause suicidal ideation any more than asking about chest pain is going to cause a heart attack. You're more often than not, somebody feels grateful that somebody recognizes it and they're able to talk about this thing that's pretty uncomfortable for them. And then if somebody is struggling, and P.S., one way that I like to ask the question that seems to help people feel more comfortable, I oftentimes say something like, God, you've got a lot going on. Is your mind handing you any thoughts about suicide? And it's, again, sort of separation. Mm-hmm. It's, no, it's not me. I don't want these, but my mind keeps putting these thoughts in there, and it's uncomfortable, and I don't know what to do with them. Mm-hmm. And so if somebody's mind is handing them thoughts of suicide, getting them to treatment. If it's a crisis and the person is a veteran, you can call the Veterans Crisis Line, 1-800-273-8255, and press 1. That number without the press 1 is just the National Suicide Prevention Hotline, so anybody can call that.
And if you call any VA in the nation, that's the first thing it says.
Yes.
If you're a veteran and you call the VA, the first thing it says is if you are having these ideologies, press 1.
Yep. And you don't actually have to be in crisis to call that.
Right.
I would much rather have somebody call before they're in crisis rather than at that point that now it's an emergency. If it's 3:00 in the morning on a Tuesday and you just need to hear another human being's voice, you can call the crisis line and they will listen to you and they will be there for you. You can drive somebody to an emergency department. You can pick up the phone and call the mental health clinic and help them schedule an appointment. There's all sorts of stuff we can do to help people get connected when we're just willing to have those conversations that may feel uncomfortable at first, but the more we have them, the easier it gets. I think another tangible thing that is important for us to talk about and that can sometimes be an uncomfortable discussion in our country is access to lethal means. And one of the most important things that we can do is if somebody is having thoughts about suicide, ask if they are a firearm owner. And if somebody is struggling with thoughts of suicide, in that moment, probably the best thing to do is take the gun and get it out of the house. And I always say when I'm talking to groups of veterans, like, I get it. You're military. You have guns. I don't want to take your guns from you. That's not what I'm saying. But what we want to do is put as many barriers as possible in between the urge to act on thoughts of suicide and the ability to act. And so, like I said, during those times of stress, when, you know, somebody's mind is handing them thoughts about suicide, be the friend that says, hey, man, do you want me to hold on to your guns for a little bit?
Right.
Be that person. Hang on to the guns for a little bit. And then when they're better, give them back. Yeah. Absolutely. Or, you know, if they're not comfortable with that, say, you know what? I've got these gun locks. Let's put them on. I'll hang on to the key. You keep the gun here. I've got the keys. If you need it, call me. I'll be here in 30 seconds, you know. Sometimes veterans don't have anybody in their life that they feel that comfortable with. And so there's this whole initiative out of the Syracuse VA called Freeze the Keys. And so what we know is just building in just a few moments of time can save lives. So if somebody doesn't feel comfortable either giving their firearms or handing the key to somebody else, storing the firearm here, storing ammunition over here, and then taking the lock to the gun lock, putting it in a Tupperware container, freezing it in a Tupperware container and putting it in the freezer. That way, the urge hits, that person has to go get the gun, go get the ammunition, then get this ball of ice and put it under the faucet and start chipping away at it. All we need is just enough time to go, oh my God, what am I doing? I don't want to die. I just want this pain to stop. And then they can reach out for help.
Well, that's really interesting. I think that's one thing actually, at least now, just listening to you talk about that initiative and the idea of, hey, let me throw your guns in my safe for, until you're feeling more like, feeling better. I don't think that's probably a conversation we're having enough. No. Because, honestly, Tom and I have talked round and round about these sorts of issues. I don't think that's literally ever something we've ever discussed. But you're right. It's something that's so simple, and we're almost, unfortunately, wherever you sit on the issue, we're kind of afraid to talk about those sorts of things, and we need to still be having those conversations. And that's so I'm really glad you mentioned that. That's honestly something I've never even heard of before. So that's
it's a conversation of safety, not gun control.
Exactly.
Yeah. But we won't go down the gun control path. But but no, because I am a advocate for having better background checks due to mental illnesses, and that's just me. I think there should be a stricter background check because I did this last year, I guess. I did a thing where I timed myself at purchasing a pistol, and we're both. I don't know who you are. I'm a registered Republican. I don't know if you are.
I'm an independent.
Yeah. Well, okay. Yeah. We're moderate independents. There we go. We'll go with that. But I time myself because I think for me, I'm okay knowing that I am okay with the gun because I feel that way about myself, as I'm sure a lot of other people do. And so I go in, talk to the guy, tell him I'm a veteran. I'm in and out like a little bit under 4 minutes.
Wow.
Oh my God.
Yeah. And I was like,
that's ridiculous.
And I was
you talk fast though. So
I do. Yeah, no, but I do.
And you're very persuasive.
And I'm very persuasive. And, but I just walked out of there and I was like, geez, man, but for me, it wasn't like, I never had obviously any thoughts of carnage. So I was like, oh, okay, I'm good. But like, I remember the guy I was with, we were both like,
well, you know, what the data show are that states that have enacted both a combination of extensive background checks and then a mandatory wait period, for states with those two on the books, there is a significant reduction in suicides when both of those. But independently, there's some data to suggest it, but it's not statistically significant. It's when you have both of those. And then 13 states have enacted red flag laws or extreme risk protection orders. And
the red flags are a little bit, to me, again, because this goes back to what I was talking about earlier, is that you only hear the negatives. So you only hear I think it was New Jersey, where the guy, no one deserves to get shot. The guy, they showed up to his house and he had a gun drawn on him already. And so that, I think when we talk about those kind of things, that's hard to get into because it's, his neighbor called the cops on him. Mm-hmm. He didn't do anything to have the cops called on him. But when the cops showed up, he did draw a weapon on him. So I think that goes back to the privacy issues as well, though, when we talk about who, it's weird because I feel like, one, I don't think anyone would ever call the cops on me for having a gun. But two, I don't think that I would ever pull a gun on a cop. Like, that's weird to me. Like that.
I honestly, I don't really know enough about the red flags. About the red flags to say I can, even form a semi-viable opinion on it. But
that's my problem with it all, is that, you only see the social media stuff about it. You only see the negative stuff about it.
I think going back to kind of what you were saying though about mandatory waiting periods and those sorts of things, like I think that there, like I said, and I am a gun owner, I love my guns, but I think we really do need to face the fact as a society that there's some serious issues we need to we need to consider moving forward. And it's really bad that everything's so tribal right now. We can't really have these conversations in a healthy manner. So,
and I do see that as part of sort of our fragmentation of society, and again, why this place can feel like such a painful place to live. Mm-hmm. And I mean, it may sound deceptively simple, but it's really not. That suicide can be preventable, and what it means is just being freaking human beings to one another again, choosing kindness, choosing respect, choosing to reach out and go the extra mile and allow some discomfort in yourself to check on another person. That somewhere along the way we seem to have sort of lost our humanity, and that's what we have to get back to.
I think a sense of community has been lost, and it's really, really hard because I believe in the world that we live in today, and it's not like a soapbox kind of thing. I truly do believe that there are so many things going on all the time. Like we live in a way faster society now, where things are constantly moving, news is constantly flowing, information's at our fingertips whenever we want it. And I think it's easier sometimes to get lost and forget that there are people out there who are struggling. That's hard to think about, because social media in its design is not meant to distract you in that way, but it does usually only show you the good in life. And so when that happens, the way your brain works and the way you can manipulate things and over time, you start not believing that, there's only good, but you really do start believing that, like, my life's the only shitty one.
Right. Because very few people post, gosh, I'm really struggling with a panic attack right now.
And you want to talk about being isolated? Like, get on Instagram and look at everything that's going on that's good, and you're having a bad day. Mm-hmm. Well, and then all of a sudden you're the only one that's having a bad day in your head. Yes, and we know it's not true. Right. But
logically,
we know it's not true. But
it's a double-edged. I mean, it's just one of those things.
And I love social media,
and I'm not near as big a fan of social media as Tom is. But
isn't a podcast a form of social media?
I guess technically, probably, yeah.
Yeah, we're creative. This is art.
But
this is art.
This is art. You have a very loose interpretation of art, my friend.
We got a blog coming out in the liberal arts and science.
That's one of the things though. Like I really struggled with was I was constantly comparing myself to other people, and like I'm not where they are in life, or I'm not. And the thing is it's really easy to look at someone and say, oh man, everything's going great for them, but you don't take a minute to like just step back and say, they're human too. There's things that they're struggling with. No matter who you are, what your circumstances are, there are going to be things in your life that are not going right. And I think it's important to remember that
my man,
not everything is as it appears on the surface sometimes.
We have no idea what's going on underneath. Whenever
my man Anthony Bourdain, that's my dream job. And when Dave Chappelle came out with his new stand up and said that, and I was like.
Yeah,
it's really suicide to me. It's one of those things. It's like there's so many studies out there, and I still to this day like think back about people that I know, and I still can't form a thought on why.
That was one of the things that we had been talking about previously was especially for our veteran population, which the suicide rate for veterans is 1.5 times greater than for the non-veteran civilian population.
Right.
And there are so many people asking why,
right.
And so from a veteran perspective, I think that it's really easy to try to say, well, it's combat.
Right.
And what we know is that it's not that simple. That two people can go through the exact same traumatic experience. One may develop PTSD or stay stuck in that recovery process, which is kind of what PTS is. And another person may go ahead and be able to fully run through that recovery process quickly and not get stuck. Same thing for two veterans who, have both been through a combat situation. That may increase risk of suicide for one, but it may not increase risk of suicide for the other, independent of whether or not they are struggling with PTS symptoms. And so that's overly simplistic to try to boil that down. In terms of the numbers, one thing that the veteran population is a male-dominated population.
Mm-hmm.
Women are much more likely to attempt suicide, but men are more likely to die by suicide. And oftentimes that can become because of the lethality of the approach. 85% of the time a firearm is used in a suicide attempt, the results are lethal. Firearms are more lethal than all other forms of or methods of suicide combined together have a 5% lethality as opposed to firearms. And so that's why we talk about them so much. And not to get too technical, but there's this theory of suicide. It's a widely accepted theory of suicide. It's Thomas Joiner's interpersonal psychological theory of suicide. And basically, when we look at deaths by suicide, there has to be a combination of the desire for death and then also the ability to act on those. Because actually, thoughts about suicide, most people have had at least a passing thought at one point in their life. It's not uncommon to have a thought pop into your head at one point or another. It is relatively rare to act on those thoughts.
Right.
So when we look at deaths, what we see is if you remember your Venn diagrams, that desire for death seems to be related to a combination of what we call a sense of thwarted belongingness and a sense of burdensomeness. And when we look in a military population, that thwarted belongingness, that sense of utter aloneness, you said, when you got out, you just, sometimes people just don't even want to be around, but you lose your tribe. I have talked to veteran after veteran who have said, you cannot describe the connectedness among active duty military members. You are living in close proximity. You are wearing the same uniform. You are saying the same words. You have a common mission. People who are willing to lay down their lives at a moment's notice for one another, and some people who have laid down lives for one another. And that level of intimacy just doesn't exist anywhere else. Not even in marriage. And I don't, it sounds weird to compare those two, but people will say, I can't even tell my wife what I would be able to say to my buddy. And then when you transition out of the military, all of a sudden, you're on your own.
Yep.
And you're out here and you're trying to live your life and nothing is making sense anymore. And so that sense of burdensomeness, or that sense of thwarted belongingness, I think gets exacerbated in a military population. And when we look at deaths by suicide, when they occur over the lifespan for veterans, we see there's two spikes. One is at about 25 years after separation from the military. That's about 3.6%. And I think of that as, you've been going, you probably, transitioned out and then had another career, stayed busy. You retire from that career, and all of a sudden, all of that stuff that you didn't want to think about starts popping up. And sometimes people don't know what to do with that. The other spike is within the first year after separation. About 3.2% of deaths by suicide occur in that first year. And in that of the people who die in that first year by suicide, 43% occur within the first 90 days after separating from the military. And so there's something profoundly isolating about transitioning out. And I think that it affects our veterans in this very specific way, because all of a sudden your tribe is gone and you don't know what to do. The other piece then of that Venn diagram that seems to lead to a desire for death is that sense of burdensomeness. And I think we had talked about that somebody can have a really high level position in the military and then they transition out, and that doesn't translate into civilian qualifications. And so somebody that had a really high level position may be struggling to find an entry level position in the civilian world. Yep. And things don't make sense anymore. Yep. And then I also think in terms of that sense of burdensomeness, there's an automatic sense of purpose and importance in the military. You know what your mission is. It's a shared mission. And you get out into the civilian world and all of a sudden it's like, what's this all about? And I can't unsee what I have seen, and I can't unknow what I know about the world. And so much of this life feels insignificant, and I can't do anything about it. And so that sense of burdensomeness can be compounded in a veteran population, I think. And that's when things really get dangerous. Anytime somebody says to you that they feel like a burden on the ones they love the most, that can be a very dangerous situation, because most people in their right minds, when they're thinking logically, when they've got their prefrontal cortex attached, they know suicide never helps the people that they love the most. It always hurts a lot. But when somebody is that far down into that well of depression that they, just in that moment, genuinely believe that by being alive, they're hurting the ones that they love the most, that's when suicide in their minds in that moment feels like a selfless act. But even then, most people who have a thought or even an urge to act on thoughts of suicide don't. And so that third piece of Joiner's theory is this acquired capability to act on thoughts of suicide. In a veteran population, we have a group of people, whether through genetics or training, have had that fear of death sort of habituated out of them. And so in order to act on thoughts of suicide, we have to go against our brain's very nature, which is survival. And so when somebody has been trained to not fear death, this is a group of people that when the explosion happens, they're running toward the explosion, not away from it. That in and of itself is not a risk factor, but when you pair it with the desire for death, people are way more likely to act on those thoughts. We can also see a habituation to death and dying, particularly people who have been in a combat situation. When death doesn't feel like such a foreign concept anymore, it's easier to act on those. And then again, as we've noted, you can't ignore the access to and familiarity with firearms. And so you put all of that together, and that starts to maybe give us a picture of why that veteran death rate by suicide is significantly higher than for our civilian population.
Yeah. One of the things that I have noticed, probably more than anything, is that when we talk about suicide with veterans, one of the things that always comes up is not so much, they don't look at it as a death as much as they do almost like a freeing of the oppressed. And that's a weird way to look at it if you think about it, but they see it more as in, I'm not so much concerned with dying as much as I'm just not concerned with living.
Yes. And we have to look at both of those.
Right. And so I always found that interesting because anytime that I've had any thoughts of suicide, the two things that have always popped in my mind is, one, the only reason I'm doing a lot of the things I'm doing today is because I wanted to prove to my parents that I could come from where I came from and be better than I was. And two, I always look to the future, and Jeff, we talked about this a lot. The reason I do the podcast and the reason I want to be a doctor, and I'm actually like signing a National Guard contract. I'm going back and going to try first selection for SF. Is because I always wanted to continue trying to do things. So the one thing that has always kept me away, I believe, from slipping too far is that I always tried to look ahead. I always tried to the short-term, long-term goal effect, but I always tried to make life worth living. And I think that when you take a step back and you have realistically convinced yourself that there's no other reason to live, that's to me the dangerous point. And I think that's the problem when you talk about the isolation with the veterans, is because you get alone and you don't have that person or the the tribe effect. Is it Sebastian Junger that
yes,
does
tribe? And that's why I use that word. I recognize that it may be viewed as cultural appropriation, but I also I think it has such such a meaning for this level of connection.
Yeah. And the one thing that I think that veterans don't hear enough, and this is where I really do like social media a ton, I love it, is that you can reach out to different groups. I mean, there's Team Red, White, and Blue are doing this. I don't know if you know who they are. They're doing a lot of stuff now, which I think is very, very cool. But I mean, just on a small scale, there's a guy that owns Operators Association. His name's John Allen. He's a former Navy SEAL. Usually guys that have 20, 30,000 followers, they don't talk to you on like a one-on-one kind of thing. You could right now, any veteran right now, you could message John on Instagram and he'll talk to you. You can message me on Instagram, by the way, too. I'll talk to you all day. I have no problem with that. If you go to our Facebook and look at the Kensington Corner, it says like, there's this thing for like groups where it says like how quickly they message back. Yeah. Ours is like immediately.
That's awesome.
Ours is like, immediately.
It's all
These are two lonely people sitting in front of their computers.
These are two isolated gentlemen. Just hit us back. But I don't have a fascination with suicide, but I do have a fascination with fixing it, because suicide for me is one of the few things in life that I don't, and I'm say this again humbly, one of the few things I don't quite understand. I've never been able to wrap my head around it. Mm-hmm. And I think that's one, why it's so frustrating, and two, why it's so important, because as you said earlier, we've all had thoughts. Jeff and I have talked about this. We've had thoughts, but I just, I couldn't imagine where, not that I think so highly of myself, I just could not imagine where my life would be, like I couldn't imagine where Jeff would be without me.
Yeah.
And that's, I don't know what he'd do.
And I mean, that's why it is so important for us to talk about the fact that treatment works. I think sometimes people develop coping strategies that work in the short term, but long term actually just make life more painful. And I talk about these, especially when I'm working with folks over on the stress disorders treatment program. I go over once a round and and go talk about PTSD and suicide risk. And I don't want to give the idea that PTSD is like the most common diagnosis that we see associated with suicide risk, because it's not. There can be an increased risk for folks with PTSD. But so we talk about these things that on this, at first feel really helpful, but then long-term make life more painful. And frankly, I'm flabbergasted whenever I meet somebody that has struggled with post-traumatic stress and hasn't had a substance use disorder, because short-term, it works great. Like, you can go to sleep and you can go to the grocery store at times other than 2:00 in the morning, and you can go to the family reunion. But then longer term, it takes more and more and more of that substance. And now you've got a substance use problem on top of struggling with, post-traumatic stress already, and life starts to feel out of control. We see people doing real reckless and risky behavior. Somebody that's driving 120 miles an hour down I-70 on a crotch rocket without a helmet on, I say to myself, well, that person's probably been in combat.
You'd probably be right.
Because, if my adrenaline is going to be spiking on a daily, on an hourly basis, at least I can be in control of it just for a moment, I also see a lot of overscheduling, somebody that's a workaholic, somebody that's constantly got something going, because as long as that's what my mind is thinking about,
you don't have time for anything else.
Yep. Yeah. It's when things are quiet and calm that my mind starts to throw me those thoughts and memories that I don't think I can handle. And then the other one I see a lot of is, I call it drama instead of trauma.
Yeah.
And when I'm talking to a group of veterans who are in the midst of struggling with post-traumatic stress disorder, I'll say, have any of you ever felt like a crazy magnet in relationships? And they're like, oh, yeah, that's me. And it's like, and sometimes we subconsciously choose drama.
Yep.
Because that's what our brain gets focused on. And as long as what I'm consumed with is, I love you, I hate you, you cheated, no, I didn't, oh, baby, come back. As long as that's what I'm dealing with.
There's a sense of importance.
Yeah. And my brain is busy.
Yeah.
It's when things are quiet and calm that the brain says, oh, now we can start to process through that trauma. And so I think that sometimes, and that's why I think it's important to understand why those coping strategies occur. It's not because somebody is bad or weak-willed or choosing substances or drama over families or connections or work. It's because the thought of having those memories and feelings come in feels so terrifying that they are willing to do just about anything to get away from them. And so, but then the harder they try to cope, the more life feels out of control. And I think that that's sometimes how we get to that place where somebody says, I'm done. I can't do this anymore, because the harder I try, the worse it gets.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so that's why it is so important for us to have that message of treatment works. You don't have to keep doing it that way over and over again. This hurts. This is painful. Come over here. We can help you. We can teach you.
That's the name of the episode, man. Treatment works.
I'm okay with that.
Yeah, I like that.
So, in closing, I'd like to do just one question each for me and you.
Go ahead, yeah.
Do you have one?
Not off the top of my head right now. She actually just answered my last question about substance abuse. So
I have one that I'm super curious about, and especially curious about in the state of Kansas. Kansas, I believe, last I checked, is still one of 3 states that does not do medical marijuana. We are now seeing a lot of studies being done that show psilocybin is, can be used to treat, depression, anxiety, and suicide. Maybe, we'll see. What are your thoughts on that, though? Because one thing that I hear a lot from veterans who get out are, I wish I could get like a medical marijuana card. I wish that I could eat edibles instead of taking Zoloft. I wish that I could eat shrooms and or not even shrooms, but the to go and have the injectable psilocybin done and have that kind of treatment done, but it's not offered. So I'm just curious of your thoughts on that.
So I'm not going to pretend to be an expert in terms of medical marijuana.
Okay.
And I too have, read these benefits. Absolutely. from my limited clinical perspective of working specifically, and I'm talking about, with PTSD, what we know is that really one of the only ways to truly heal significant PTSD is to work through that experience, to emotionally process through that experience. And I'll probably be more long-winded than you want, but
no, fire away.
Okay,
Fire
okay,
away.
okay.
Because the reason I asked too is because I'm huge on I'm not, I don't want to sound like a big government person, but I'm huge on the way Colorado has done stuff, because you know what strain you're getting. Because when I first got out, I thought, it's been 10 years, I'm going to smoke pot. And I was like, I cannot, about 30 days. And I was like, I could not do this. I was losing my mind as far as like anxiety wise. Like I would smoke and then I wouldn't do anything. And I would just hang out. And I was like, this is miserable. I was like, why would anyone want to live like this? And so I didn't anymore, obviously. Right. But I am also ignorant on the medical side of it, how they're doing these things, because there are studies that show that there have been, a ton of positive results, and I'm just curious about them, I guess.
So yeah, so when I think of a brain with PTSD, so I think of our brains, our memory stores as like a bunch of filing cabinets in the back of our heads, and every experience that we've had gets processed through and then filed away. So I oftentimes will ask people, like, who taught you how to ride a bicycle? For me, it was my sister Jody. And if I choose, I can go into that filing cabinet and pull it up. And with, specific accuracy, I can remember the paint, the, metallic flecks of paint on that bicycle. I can see the plastic basket and the little flowers on it. And the blue one had a thing, and the streamers. And I can experience that exhilaration of, going and realizing that Jody had let go of the bicycle and then the ground coming up to meet me. I can really vividly pull that up. And then when I'm done with that memory, I put it back in the filing cabinet and I shut the drawer. And that memory is probably cross-referenced with memories of my sister, probably cross-referenced with later adult pursuits of exercise. But tonight when I go home and I'm eating my spaghetti, my brain isn't going to be throwing that memory at it because I filed it back away. Unprocessed trauma memories, I think about like red rubber balls bouncing around in those filing cabinets. And again, PTSD, I think of as somebody who is stuck in the healing process. And for whatever reason, either they weren't able to, or it wasn't safe for them to emotionally process through that experience at the time that it happened. Specific to combat trauma, if you took the time to process through what you were going through, you never would have made it out alive. And so for survival, you shut off that ability to feel. You don't have access to it in the moment. But your brain knows that its job is to process through all of those emotional experiences. And whether or not somebody had access to those emotions at the time that it was happening, the brain was experiencing those emotions. And so then when we get into a place of relative quiet, the brain goes, now it's time. And so it starts, and when the brain throws those emotion or those memories at you, it doesn't tend to do it in a real nice, neat, linear, beginning to end. It tends to throw the hottest or the most horrific or the worst part. And it's natural when something like that pops into your head, nobody wants to think about the worst thing that ever happened to them. And so it's really natural to go and shove that away. But the problem is your brain is going to keep throwing it at you in different ways. That's why nightmares happen. We lose conscious control and the brain is like, oh, this is a great time to process through this. And it feels really out of control. What we know, when we can emotionally process through that over and over and over again, then we can put it away in a filing cabinet. And it might be filed under horrific shit, but it's filed and it doesn't have to keep throwing it at you. So this is a very long-winded way of saying, I don't care if someone wants to smoke the pot. That is fine. But I don't want somebody to have to smoke the pot in order to exist. And so if somebody is if somebody is using marijuana to numb, what I oftentimes see is that they are existing, but they're unable to process through emotional experiences. And so it feels more tolerable, but in the long run, all of this stuff is still building up under the surface. And then it takes more and more and more emotional energy to keep pushing that down and to keep suppressing. And so then it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, and life feels more and more and more out of control. So from a clinical perspective, specifically related to PTSD, I would much rather have somebody not have those substances in them, go ahead and engage fully, learn that emotions are safe. Emotions are not dangerous. It's the stuff we do to get away from emotions that can be dangerous. But I always say emotions are like armpits. We just have them. It's what you do with them that can be dangerous. And so don't be afraid to feel. Don't be afraid to remember. Work through that. And then if you're at this place in life where you want to smoke, okay, I'm not judging, go. So I guess that's the take that I have on it. Like I said, I'm ignorant of a lot of the medical.
Me too.
Yeah. Okay.
You got another one?
I got one that
All right.
I'm gonna take yours. What are your thoughts on? And this is I don't know. It's a weird one. What are your thoughts on the veteran feeling betrayed? One, by government, two, by leadership. A lot of returning combat veterans feel like that their own unit put them in positions to where they had to make sacrifices as a human, and I get that's war. We know that. And a lot of times it's gotten better. And I'm on both sides of the fence on what I think about this. But especially during the Vietnam era war, boot camp taught you basically how to view another human as not a human. And so when you talk to a lot of Vietnam veterans, they have still to this day embedded racism due to basic training and what they went through. And what I have seen with a lot of the newer generation guys is that early on in the war, there were a lot of people who also had, that tag to them. And then you see people now, I believe, that have not, they sympathize more with what's going on, especially with a lot of the civilian deaths that took place with the wars in the Middle East. And I've always been curious about that, because a lot of the things that I see with the veterans in the VA, it's always an act of betrayal, is what it seems like. They always feel like someone has done something wrong to them, and I'm curious what you think the steps are moving forward, how we get away from that kind of, because it's really toxic thoughts to begin with. Because like I told you earlier, I mean, and I know I'm just a small sample size, but the VA has been nothing but great to me. But I also live in an area where I have a great VA hospital 20 miles up the road. I'm very lucky in that. I don't feel like everyone shares that opinion with me. So I'm curious.
So there's a lot to unpack there, and yes. I don't know that I will fully do it justice. There is a growing body of research on what we call moral injury. And, in certain occupations, in certain positions, we ask people to act or to bear witness to things that sort of go beyond what we view as being within the realm of humanity. And then we ask them to hold on to that and somehow just move forward with their lives. And it can have grave implications in terms of, if I did that, or conversely, if I witnessed that but didn't do anything about it. In fact, some of the traumas that are most associated with later suicide risk are peacekeeping traumas. People that might go in with like United Nations and be asked to bear witness to this horrible depravity that human beings are capable of, but then told to stand down, and you can't engage. And then we ask people to hold that. And for some people, it damages that sense of humanity inside themselves, and they start to think of themselves as other than human. Again, we can heal that. It's a complicated process, and it has to do with, I think, somebody's own spiritual journey and their own emotional journey, and talking through this and making sense of things and recognizing that we can't look at wartime through our peacetime eyes. But I think that sometimes people that get stuck, and a huge part of that sense of moral injury can be feeling betrayed by the government, by their leaders, that is the way that their brain is organizing that information. And then sometimes that can get stuck in a pattern. And so, I mean, we know that nobody ever sees reality as it actually is. If somebody interviewed us after we leave this room and said, hey, what went on in there, hopefully it'd be somewhat similar, but each one of us came into this with different perspectives, with different ideas, with different goals, with different views. And so each one of us is seeing what's unfolding right here in a very different way. And so sometimes people can have their filter on, and if that filter only lets through ways that people screw me over, ways that people mistreat me, ways that, then sometimes your entire world can seem that way, because that's the only thing that's getting through that filter. And what they're missing are all the times that people randomly smiled at them in the hallway, all the times people tried to reach out to them, all of the times people called them to check and see how they're doing, or went out of their way to do something nice. But if that doesn't make it through that cognitive filter, it just bounces right off. And that's another way that therapy can be helpful, is that, in cognitive therapy is restructuring how we see the world and trying to make it a bit more accurate. Not to say that the world is sunny sunshine all the time, but man, if you miss the really beautiful, precious pearls in life and they're just bouncing right off your filter, then life feels pretty miserable.
Yeah, definitely.
Well, I would just like to say thank you so much for taking the time to sit down with us this afternoon. This has been so enjoyable for me. I'm sure Tom would say the same thing. I'm going to speak for you now, actually. So, but no, we really do appreciate you taking the time out of your very busy day, I'm sure. And this was absolutely enjoyable. Thank you.
Well, same for me. I appreciate being able to sit down with you guys and do this as well. Thank you. I was really nervous coming on here because I'm in my 40s chronologically, but I'm in my 80s technologically.
Right on.
And so I've never actually listened to a podcast before.
Well, now you'll have an excuse.
Now you have to. But no, thank you so much. Really, I appreciate it, because this is something that was very important to us. And then on top of that, actually, when we did the article for Lauren Scherner World, I think I told you this. I thought that you were the one that told them to call us, because we sit down with her and she goes, yeah, you guys are a health podcast about PTSD, right? And I was like, yeah. But I was like, well, sure, no. I was like, no, we're a general topic conversation with some focus in health. And she was like, yeah, PTSD, we're good.
I would love to take credit for setting it up, but I can't.
I know, but I really do appreciate that so much. It was an honor.
Right back at you.
Thank you.
Thank you. All right, everyone, have a great night. Really hope you enjoyed this episode. And as always, did you want to plug your Instagram or anything?
I just told you I'm bad on social media.
No, not even that, but like
I don't have Instagram.
How about Topeka VA? Or is there anything out there that you would want to plug veteran-wise? Jason, anybody?
Yes, our upcoming mental health summit on Friday, the 27th. Yep. We've got coming up at the Dole Institute of Politics. Also, maybe just want to throw a plug out there for the app, the Virtual Hope Box. So anybody can download it. It's a free VA DoD venture, and it's just it's really got a lovely safety planning and contacts to call and videos or pictures that you can put in that just reminds you of why life is precious and what keeps you tethered to this earth. So I tell everybody to download the Virtual Hope Box.
Amazing.
Awesome. Thank you so much. Good night, everybody.